Hi everyone, and welcome to 10 Billion Mouths to Feed, Emissions, Urban Agriculture and Development. The learning objectives for this session are shown here, and we'll be following up with a survey and more information on how to receive credit from AIA. We'll collect questions submitted to the Q&A box throughout the session, and if the speaker isn't able to get to your questions, we'll have them answer in writing and share on the website after the teach-in. Now it's my pleasure to introduce the speakers for this session, Michael Grove and Henry Gordon-Smith. Michael Grove is the chair of landscape architecture, civil engineering, and ecology at Sasaki and sits on Sasaki's board of directors. Leading much of the firm's work in Asia, he's a fierce advocate for the vital role that landscape architects play in shaping contemporary cities. Today, in conversation with Henry Gordon-Smith, a sustainability strategist who speaks, writes, and consults globally on urban agriculture, water issues, and emerging technologies, as the CEO and managing director of Agritecture Consulting, he'll talk about the potential of urban agriculture to feed the world's growing population in the context of rapid urbanization. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Natasha, for that excellent introduction. What my bio doesn't mention, though, is that although I'm trained as a landscape architect, I was probably a chef in another life. I love food. I love to eat it. I love to talk about it. Food is really at the core of who we are and how we interact with each other in society, and it plays a hugely important role in how we make decisions about the land. But as our cities continue to grow, the question of how we source our food is one that rarely comes to mind. In fact, before the pandemic, when this conference would have likely been in a giant windowless convention center, we'd take it for granted that there would have been food outside the auditorium waiting for us, having magically come from somewhere. Let me put things in perspective as it relates to cities. I live in Boston, which has about 4.6 million people in the metro area, which means that assuming most people are eating breakfast, lunch, and dinner, Bostonians are consuming about 14 million meals per day. And although we in Boston like to think we're the hub of the universe, we're actually only the 89th largest city in the world. We've barely cracked the top 100. Imagine being in Shanghai, Delhi, or Tokyo, where populations are upwards of 20 and even 30 million. That means anywhere from 69 to 114 million meals are being consumed every day. All of that food needs to be planted, grown, harvested, processed, packaged, transported, purchased, prepared, eaten, and disposed of. That's quite a life cycle for our food, and I'm willing to bet that most people here are typically involved in only about 3 of those activities. For most humans, this has become our natural environment. What we often don't realize is that we are just as dependent on the natural world as our ancient ancestors were. So how did we get here? Well, it really started about 10,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent, where 2 critical inventions, agriculture and urbanism, happened roughly in the same place at the same time. From that point forward, agriculture and cities were bound together. We see that play out in both ancient and contemporary urban form. Here in the city of Ur in about 2000 BC, density is focused at the core with farmland beyond. This isn't that different than how we currently live today, and with the exception being that everything is much larger and more spread apart in our modern cities. Even by the 1st century AD, Rome had about 1 million people to feed, which meant that it had to begin importing food from far away. This need to feed growing cities was in fact the very beginning of imperialism. The physical form of our cities was also influenced by food. These are just a few interesting street names in London, all of which provide clues to the activities in the city at that time, like Cornhill, Bread Street, or Pudding Lane. You probably have something similar in your city. Here in Boston, we have Quincy Market. In Seattle, there's Pike Place Market. In London, there's Borough Market. And in San Francisco and countless other cities around the world, Market Street. A few years ago, my firm, Sasaki, did a survey to better understand how people feel about their cities. One question was about what gets people excited about where they live. We thought that they would answer something like amazing parks or the incredible architecture, but the winner was actually food. 46% of respondents said that they'd make a trek out of their neighborhood to try a new restaurant. We're a species that follows our stomachs. Beyond our cities, something that many believe has made America great is our agrarian history. But our romanticized version of the American farm couldn't be further from today's reality. Take contemporary Iowa, for example. Thought of by many as America's breadbasket, Iowas surprisingly have very little access to local food. Although Iowa ranks third in agricultural production, most of the food Iowans eat comes from an average of 1,200 miles away. All of those farms aren't growing the fresh food that Iowans need. It's growing commodity crops like corn and soybeans to feed livestock or to go into processed foods. Less than 1% of Iowa's farms and even less of its land are growing food that goes directly to humans. California is another example of our precarious situation when it comes to food security. As the 5th largest agricultural producer in the world, California grows almost half the fruits, nuts, and vegetables grown in the United States. That food needs water to grow. In California, 80% of all of the water consumed in the state goes to agriculture. In fact, one singular crop, alfalfa hay, again, which goes directly to feed livestock, not humans, requires more water than every household in California consumes on an annual basis. But what do we know about California? First, we know that it's really far away from the population centers on the east coast of the US, which means high transportation costs for our kale. And we also know that it's still recovering from its worst drought in 1,200 years. And when we look at the correlation between the counties most impacted by drought and the percentage of the country's fruits and vegetables that are grown there, the nation's food supply has reached an unacceptable level of risk. And it's not just California. Florida is in an equally precarious situation, accounting for nearly 1/3 of many of our fruits and vegetables. Whether drought in California, epic flooding in the plains, or higher intensity storms and sea level rise in Florida, climate change has an immeasurable impact on our food supply, especially to crops, which are already highly vulnerable to shifts in weather patterns. This isn't just an American problem, though we certainly aren't leading by example. Around the world, 19 million hectares of rainforests are lost every year. This destruction doesn't just release carbon, it reduces biodiversity and increases the threat of diseases like COVID-19. By infringing on these ecosystems, we are reducing the natural barriers between humans and host species, creating ideal conditions for diseases to spread. These microbes are not naturally human pathogens. They become human pathogens because we are offering them that opportunity. All of that is to say that food as we know it today is not sustainable. This is not the future we were promised. When I was a kid in the 1980s, Willy Wonka suggested that chewing a piece of gum would provide you with the same nutrition as eating a 3-course meal. Pan Am was going to offer nutritional liquid lunches on our next transatlantic flights. And all of our food would be engineered and available in pill form. The Jetsons even promised us a machine where our food would magically appear at the press of a button. Unfortunately, these versions of the future have led us down a path of convenient processed foods. Starting in the 1950s and continuing through to today, many of us drive to big boxes at the edge of our cities to buy packaged food that's produced by one of 5 multinational corporations that control 80% of the agriculture on the entire planet. Think about that for a minute. Just 5 companies control 80% of the food that we eat. This needs to change. And it is. Soil-based rooftop farms, like this one built by the Brooklyn Grange, are starting to pop up in cities around the world. They produce hyper-local food while also reducing urban heat islands and helping buildings to become more energy efficient. It's even happening at some of our most beloved landmarks, like Fenway Park here in Boston, where Green City Growers manages a farm on the roof of the baseball stadium, producing food that goes directly into the salad that you might be eating while you're watching the game. Universities around the world are also experimenting with feeding their student populations. This is Thammasat University in Thailand, which just opened this rooftop farm and has the added benefit of capturing and storing stormwater. While some of those examples are seasonal, it doesn't have to be. In Maine, here in the US, where it's winter for just about 9 months of the year, hydroponically grown tomatoes are sold throughout New England for nearly the same costs as those imported from California or Mexico. Lettuce too, such as at this greenhouse operated by Little Leaf Farms outside of Boston. So by now, maybe you're feeling a bit more optimistic that there are solutions for our food problems. Unfortunately, there's still a little bit more gloom and doom to share first. It's no secret that the planet's population is growing exponentially and that most of those people live in urban areas. Growing cities mean growing appetites. To meet those needs, we need to increase global food production by about 70%. And even though our climate is changing, the way we're farming isn't. With the exception of mechanization and the increasing loss of biodiversity as a result of large corporate farms, agriculture hasn't really changed in eons, even though there are so many more of us occupying the planet. It's clear to me that the future of farming is urban. Sometimes we're not doing ourselves any favors as architects by suggesting utopian ideas without the science backing them first. Though there's a lot to be said about being provocative to get people excited, and this is a necessary step in the process. It's not all science fiction though, it's happening. Vertical urban farms, though they're still experimental, are becoming viable enterprises. But as with most new ideas, there are skeptics. Are cities really the most appropriate places for food production? Right now, the financials may be still questionable, but if we look at the long game, where transportation costs increase, climate change creates new variables, and advances in technology makes indoor growing cheaper, I believe there's real promise. We're in an incredible age of disruption. Imagine when autonomous vehicles are no longer experimental. We probably won't need the amount of infrastructure that's currently dedicated to parking. Again, this change is already happening. In Singapore, fresh produce is grown in vertical farms and is available for nearly half the cost of organic greens imported from Japan. Now, much of my work is in Asia, and for good reason. Cities in Asia and Africa are already some of the largest in the world, and that trajectory just continues. In China, the problem of growing cities is especially acute, with people in agriculture competing for the same land. All of China's arable land lies in the eastern half of the country, which also corresponds to where about 93% of the population lives. This conflict has resulted in a sobering amount of agricultural land lost to development, about 123,000 square kilometers in the span of a decade. Again, for those of you who need a visual aid, that's just about equivalent to the size of the state of Iowa. Of the farmland that remains, about 20% is contaminated. For you visual folks, those polluted areas represent just about half the landmass of California. China's use of pesticides and fertilizer is rising faster than any other country on Earth, and with dire consequences. Now, you're all here to learn about carbon, and it's probably already crossed your mind that growing our food locally is the best solution because of the carbon we can save on transportation alone. You're not wrong, but our food's carbon footprint from transportation averages only about 5%. 80% is a result of our land use choices, whether it's the lost embodied carbon from destroying remnant forest or a similar disruption to native habitat. That burger you ate, 660 gallons of water went into producing it, and cattle production is responsible for 80% of the planet's deforestation. Yet we're not changing our habits. In China, imports of beef have increased 19,000% over the last decade. So I've convinced you to try an Impossible Burger, and I commend you for that, but I'm sorry to burst your bubble. Soy production is second to beef in terms of environmental damage. Soy that goes directly to feeding humans is great, and it's absolutely progress in the right direction. The problem is that much of the world's soy crop is grown in places like Brazil, where it is planted on land that was once tropical rainforest. So fantastic, you'll switch your primary protein to seafood instead, but shrimp farming is the largest driver of mangrove deforestation. Mangroves are one of the most carbon-rich ecosystems on the planet, and their destruction releases carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere that makes farm shrimp more environmentally damaging than pork or poultry. Our current diets and production practices are degrading terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems, depleting water sources, and driving climate change. So you're finally ready for the good news. I believe that vertical farms are an opportunity to leapfrog to the next generation of how cities source their food. At the Sunqiao Urban Farm in Shanghai, we're building a collection of vertical farms that will supply much of the city's leafy greens locally, year-round, and at an economically viable scale. The light at the end of the tunnel is that Chinese cities are perfect for vertical farming. In Shanghai, the average diet consists of about 56% leafy greens, which are the ideal crop for hydroponic systems. These systems are projected to increase yields by about 40 to 100 times what a traditional soil-based farm could produce. Vertical farms also mean that you don't have to worry about if your vegetables were grown in contaminated soils. This isn't to say that we don't have to address the problems of traditional farming, but perhaps we can more quickly transition those lands to a better use, like habitat restoration and reforestation. They're also living laboratories, allowing Shanghai's urban residents, many of whom have never even seen a working farm, to learn about how their food is grown. I believe that vertical agriculture, like at Sunchao, needs to quickly become a fixture in cities around the world. And in spite of where we find ourselves today, I'm optimistic about our future with food. And I'm going to pass the baton to Henry to walk us through more detail on some exciting advances that are changing this narrative.
Thank you, Michael. Let me just pull up my slides here. I really enjoy your presentations, Michael, because I think you really capture both the history and then also the paradoxes of our food system, which is really important. And is a good intro to what I'm going to talk about. So as an urban farming consultant, I spend a lot of time thinking about what is the right urban farm for the right location. And my job today is to sort of help you frame your thinking and create some methodologies and tools for you to think about the potential sustainability impact of different kinds of urban farms. So take a look here. We've got 3 different kinds of urban farms. These are real farms. We've got one in Montreal. It's a rooftop hydroponic greenhouse. Got one in Paris. This is a rooftop soil-based greenhouse or a rooftop farm. We've got one in Kyoto, which is a vertical farm, which is that method that Michael was talking about, stacked indoor hydroponic systems for year-round production. Which of these is best? Which of these is the best vertical farm, or the best urban farm rather, in the world? Well, the answer is really that none of them are, because there's really no one size fits all when it comes to urban agriculture. Because of those paradoxes that Michael talked about, how the complexity of some things might seem sustainable, but they aren't, or some things might seem like they're going to make the right impact or not, you really need to use design thinking to make the right choice for the opportunities in the urban context to grow food. So this is one way to frame your thinking. When you're looking at urban farms or thinking about an urban farm, you can kind of go on a spectrum of technology from low tech to high tech. And along this spectrum, you have trade-offs. On the low tech side, we have more of an impact on biodiversity. We have more of an impact on stormwater management. While on the high tech side, like vertical farming, like Michael mentioned, you have the potential to grow year-round leafy greens for a really large population. And then in the middle, you have kind of everything that kind of you could balance, right? Hydroponic greenhouses sometimes use less energy because they use sunlight, but they take up more space in the city than a vertical farm. So there's a lot to unpack here, but I really just want you to start thinking about the fact that there are trade-offs across the spectrum, and this is one way to frame it for you. As you analyze these urban farms, we can break it into some impact categories. So all of these farms will have a different social, economic, or environmental impact. They also can have a different impact on aesthetic, health, or education. So these are kind of the 6 ways that Agritecture looks at that. I want to focus a little bit more on the primary one, specifically environmental, for today's discussion. But again, you can literally look at any farm and rate them 1 to 5 in all of these areas, and you'll have a better understanding of those trade-offs than you did before. So where does this come from, this experience? Well, I started as a blogger researching vertical farming and urban agriculture, especially when vertical farming was very new back in 2010. And since then, I started getting consulting requests for my blog, Agritecture, and we've built a global consulting business. I think we're the only global consulting business focused solely on urban agriculture. And so we've consulted all around the world, as you can see, and that's given us a wide variety of case studies that we can look at and analyze. And so I'm going to kind of go through some of those opportunities, those case studies. Now, these aren't all clients of ours, but I'm going to analyze them kind of the way that Agritecture looks at things for the context of environmental impact. So let's go to Luffa Farms. This was that rooftop greenhouse in Montreal. And what makes Luffa Farms very exciting is that they've built the world's largest hydroponic greenhouse recently, just recently opened. And so there's a lot of exciting things about rooftop greenhouses. They can actually be connected to the building. They're maximizing unused space. They can grow year round because they are an indoor controlled environment. And because they use some sunlight, they actually use less energy in many cases than their vertical farming counterparts. And the scale of this is really quite exciting because again, Montreal is definitely a cold place. And so to take rooftops and to turn them into food producing areas is exciting. So right now, let's talk about their impact. They have 4 rooftop greenhouses across Quebec. That's pretty impressive so far. They're producing about 25,000 pounds per week, depending on the farm that they have. And they do it through a sort of CSA. So they grow some of the food and they source some other local food as well and kind of combine that. But most of the food that they're selling, they're growing on their rooftops. And it's a wide range of kind of peppers and tomatoes and leafy greens and things like that. So that's what you typically would see in greenhouses. Now, their new location is quite big, 164,000 square feet. I did some calculations. I estimate the capex of this project at about $415 million US. So combined, what's really interesting, if you look at some of the recent news, their food is now touching 2% of Montreal's 1.7 million residents. And so the long-term potential of that is that these rooftop farms could provide the benefits that they do the building. They could provide an impact on producing fresh fruits and vegetables for Montreal residents. And over 10 years, they could actually develop that and connect that to a sort of renewable grid. And you could potentially have, 100% of the fruits and vegetables for these residents in a relatively small city like Montreal be provided by rooftop and on-the-ground farms near the city. So that's the long-term potential. And so the benefits there are really going to be less food miles, less water use, because hydroponics uses about 70%, typically 70% less water than its conventional counterparts. Less waste, because we lose a lot of product from production with conventional farming. And because it's closer to the customer, we tend to waste less. More resilience to things like storms, because these are indoor farms, and potentially a lower carbon footprint, especially if this was powered by renewables. Then that would be that case. So let's move over to Paris. For all you Francophiles, we're just doing some French things today. And this is sous la fraise, which kind of means like through the strawberries. And this is a part of Paris's urban agriculture competition called Pariculture, which is a very innovative policy that provides spaces to urban farms at a low lease amount and basically accelerates urban agriculture there. And this is one of the companies that has benefited from that. And so they sort of do these like kind of scaffolding style vertical systems with a drip system, and then there's soil for that microbiology to happen within the root zones that go in these vertical spaces. So it maximizes the value per square foot, but it also is very organic and very diverse. So they grow a huge variety of products. I mean, you're talking about berries, hops, they even have their own honey. This is pretty typical for soil-based farms because they can actually grow a wider variety than their hydroponic counterparts. One of the things they also do is they create a lot of added value products like beers and things like that that are also very interesting and strong for the brand. In the end, this is still a very premium product. LVMH has one of these farms on their headquarters in Paris. Various high-end department stores are hosting these on them. I think the Paris Opera has a small version of this. So it's all very premium and really for high-end restaurants. But the potential impact here is really around reducing heat island effect that I'll get into next. But this is kind of the scale you can think about, 15,200 square feet. And look at that, the CapEx is much lower. They still have quite a high number of plants, and that's because of that verticality. But again, that lower CapEx is an opportunity for certain budgets in certain regions. Now, of course, you're not going to have year-round production because it is outdoor and winter does happen in Paris. But let's talk about the main benefit and impact of this. So, Mayor Anne Hidalgo was kind of initiating this 100 hectares of green space, 30 hectares of which should be urban agriculture. And that was really to respond to the 15,000 people that died in France in 2003 due to these extreme heat waves. So when we have concrete throughout the city, as you know, when a heat wave happens, it gets an extra 2 to 4 degrees Celsius higher, and that ends up sometimes killing our most vulnerable and certainly creating pressure on the city's health overall, and also affects performance at work. But if you actually create these green spaces, you can kind of reduce that by 2 degrees on average. So that's what these spaces are doing throughout the city, in addition to providing the food. And this is probably even some of the biggest benefit of these kinds of soil-based farms in regions where urban heat island effect is such a significant issue. And so that's, again, starting to think about what you would match there. I mean, if you did luffa farms in Paris on the same site, you wouldn't get those same benefits, because in some studies we've shown that greenhouses can actually, they don't necessarily reduce that heat island effect, because all that light comes in and actually can kind of increase the temperature in the building, for example. So there's a lot of trade-offs to look at there and to consider. Let's go over to Japan, to Kyoto. This is, again, what a vertical farm typically looks like indoors. It's a completely clean environment. You want to almost create, it's sterile. The only area that isn't sterile is really in the root zone, where the plants are performing, again, that microbial activity that's needed for nutrition to be transferred to them. But really it's about stacking systems and doing it indoors so that no matter what the weather is outside, you can grow year round. And that's all very, very exciting. So the impact of that, again, let's look at some of the scale. I've got 2 vertical farms in Japan. You can see the products are only lettuce, but they are producing 30,000 heads of lettuce per day, which is sold to retailers. So that's quite significant if you think about some of that vegetable demand that Michael mentioned in China. This could have a very big impact there. Their newest location is highly automated, a robotic vertical farm. They've reduced their labor by 50%, which has kind of dramatically changed their payback. So it's about 42,000 square feet in size just to produce those 30,000 heads of lettuce, which is pretty impressive, a yield for that kind of a footprint compared to conventional ag. But that price tag is about $20 million by Agritecture's estimates. So one of the considerations there. Now, in some regions, deforestation is a major issue, and that's the issue in Japan, which is an island state with limited arable land. So imagine as you run out of arable land, but your population still needs to be fed and you want to reduce your imports, it's important you protect that arable land for crops that cannot be grown indoors. But where you can grow indoors for crops like leafy greens and do it in a way that uses less land and less water, vertical farming starts to make a lot of sense. And that's really what has happened in Japan with the vertical farms there. And it's one of the major impacts, allowing forests to reduce the CO2 and perform their very important activities there. So is it worth the effort? Is it worth doing all of this? Well, there's an $80 billion economic opportunity according to a very robust study done in 2018 that looked at Google Earth and available spaces. At least 10% of the global supply of legumes, roots, and tubers and vegetable crops could be provided by urban farms. That's within the city itself. Now, if you look at the areas around the city, just within 50 kilometers, you're looking at, in some cases, 30 to 70% of the supply of these fruits and vegetables could be provided within cities. And in some places, if you created diverse food systems and protected those areas that are arable around cities, you could actually maintain a very, very significant food security resilience. And again, this is really important, as Michael mentioned, because 80% of our food is produced globally, is consumed in cities, rather. So cities need to be at the table and cities need to be part of agriculture. The time where cities are disconnected from agriculture, that time has passed, and we need to restore the idea of building cities with the food to feed the people within them. And again, one of my points that I like to make is that it's not just about the yields, it's about the potential that urban agriculture can provide. Through urban agriculture, we actually unlock the food, water, energy, waste nexus, the relationship between these things that are so important to understand for sustainable urban development than with any other sustainable technology, because the other ones just kind of hit little parts of it. Biodigesters, solar panels, water collection, but none of them really capture these whole things together, which urban farms do. So talking about carbon, Agritecture did an analysis for a large beverage company. And what we did is we compared a conventional farm in California to a large-scale greenhouse outside of New York City and a large-scale vertical farm outside of New York City. Long story short, from a carbon footprint perspective, vertical farms tend to have the highest carbon footprint, even considering the transportation miles to get the food from California to New York. And that's because of all of the lighting and the energy demand from that lighting and the HVAC control to keep the systems cool in the face of the warmth from those lights. Now, I want to say that the greenhouse here, which has the lowest carbon footprint in this case, is, it is year round in New York, but it doesn't use artificial lighting in this case. So what that means is that you will have slower production in the wintertime, but it does account for things like heating. It doesn't account for the lighting though. So there's a lot more to unpack here, and I'm going to talk about kind of what's needed next in the industry in a moment, but let me just speed up a bit. So this slide here is really just to help you think about the things you would want to model when you're diving deep into the sustainability impact of different kinds of farms. So you may want to look at this in the future, but these are the impacts that could happen. Insulation, which obviously you can calculate, stormwater management, biodiversity, heat island effect we talked about. This typically refers to soil, maybe unused space benefits in your facility from an indoor basement vertical farm, organic waste management, water use, food miles. These are some of the main benefits that you can go through a process of calculation when judging your individual project. So what will it take to get urban ag to be more than just a sideshow? We're going to need to improve these LEDs, again, reduce that energy cost significantly. We're going to need to have a thorough life cycle analysis. Looking at carbon footprint is not enough. We have to compare the life cycle of a conventional farm, a greenhouse, and a vertical farm. That's being done a little bit by Cornell. We're keeping an eye on that. We need more investment into operational talent. Someone has to actually run these farms. And as we've moved away from agriculture, we have less and less talent that knows how to grow properly. And we need to mature zoning so that cities can recognize this. So I'm just going to conclude here really, which is the fact that until architects, planners, and developers can access reliable models for urban ag in their cities and source the operators to run them, urban agriculture will remain a sideshow, kind of this extra thing that we don't need and won't be a major part of sustainable urban development. And so that's what we're trying to change in Agritecture, is make that realistic. We've created a simple tool to allow you to do that. You can go to design.agritecture.com and get started for free. And in this, you can actually estimate the CapEx, OpEx, yield, and number of people food provided for in any greenhouse or vertical farm around the world. So take a look at that, because we built it for planners, developers, and entrepreneurs. And thank you so much for listening today. We're excited to take your questions. Spoke a little quickly today. Sorry about that. Okay, are we handling the questions on our own, Michael, you think?
I'm here for the questions.
Oh.
My my internet has been a little bit spotty. So just
Okay.
to our attendees, Michael and Henry are prepared to take it over if I'm freezing up too much. But we do have some questions that we've received. The first is, are hydroponically raised produce as nutritious? The soil microbiome is full of goodness that deliver important micronutrients.
That is a really great question. And I think a number of answers to that. In general, they're even more nutritious. First of all, a lot of the hydroponic vegetables are grown in a growing medium, a soilless growing medium, which provides all the same nutrients, if not more, than in soil. More importantly, on average, the vegetables that we eat, after 3 days of being harvested, they've lost about 30% of their nutrients. And after about a week to 10 days of transport and sitting on your grocery store shelves, they've lost almost 70 to 80% of their nutrient value. In some spinach varieties, you can lose 90% of nutritional value within 24 hours of harvest. So although there's obviously great nutrients in soil, the amount of time from them to get to us from when they're harvested to on our plates and our mouths, that's where the nutrient loss happens. So what's great about vertical farming, urban agriculture is getting that freshly grown produce to our consumers much quicker.
I totally agree with that. Freshness is one of the major drivers for nutritional value at consumption. So I think that matters more.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So the next question is, how have the fires in the West impacted agriculture?
I mean, that's one of the great issues that we're facing with climate change and other issues. Agriculture is hugely impacted by that, whether it's wildfire, drought, hurricane, sea level rise, riverine floods. We have a very vulnerable crop that's susceptible to swings in the environment. And so as much as you can start to control some of that environment through CEA, controlled environment agriculture, the less risk you have from those catastrophic events. It's not to say we shouldn't be doing our best to prevent all of those, but it's just another layer that we can add for food security.
Thanks. In your personal opinion, and I think this could be a question for either of you, what is the most sustainable urban agriculture farming solution for future cities when comparing low versus high tech, soil versus soilless, and other decisions?
Did you listen to the talk? Context matters. It matters a lot. There's not one size fits all everywhere. I mean, I think if we could provide all of the food we needed for everyone by growing in soil and restoring soil in that process, right? So when we grow in the soil, we actually store carbon as well, which is an extra benefit. So if you list all the benefits, certainly if you could do that, where it's so close to the customer that waste and that nutrition loss that Michael mentioned is also removed. And if you could do that year round, like let's say if we all lived in California and had farms around, that would be the ideal, because we'd be low carbon, local, all those benefits. But that's just not realistic when we're trying to feed 10 billion people. So we have to mix and match. We have to think about the right solution for the specific challenge at hand. Unfortunately, there is not one way, but if I had to pick a utopia around agriculture, that would be it. We don't want to have to use plastic and metal to grow our food all the time. We would love to just use natural organic sources all the time, but we have to adapt to the fact that our climate is changing and our population has risen and our urbanization is out of control.
Thank you. In your opinion, does the birth of these new production methods mean that we need to rethink new professional figures that go beyond the architect's capabilities? What are the skills required for the design of a farm?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. This is a learning curve for me as an architect, landscape architect. You know, to become more versed in what it takes to grow crops, especially in kind of a controlled environment system. So I think there's a whole new generation of specialists that can become urban farmers, and that's part of what Henry does at Agritecture is providing the workshops for people to understand all the skills that they need to be entrepreneurs in this. So a lot of these urban farms, whether they're grown in freight containers or on rooftops in vertical trays, it involves software, it's robotics. There's kind of less traditional labor out there harvesting, but it's a high-tech workforce that's required, and absolutely we need training. Henry, you probably know way more.
Yeah, it's a great question, really exciting, because there is this really exciting new opportunity for it. So I always wanted to be an architect. I didn't end up going that pathway. And as I started kind of moving from being a blogger to an urban farming consultant, we started these workshops called Agritecture Design Workshops. And we did one with Sasaki. And this was really about like the dream team for developing an urban farm. And so every team had a sustainability manager, an architect, an engineer, a grower, and sort of like a business person, entrepreneur, business person, and a marketing person, right? And I know that sounds like the dream team for anything, but really that's what applies for urban farming. And we created a step-by-step methodology in those workshops that's the foundation of Agritecture's practice. And I was kind of hanging out and I was like, oh, you know, I always wanted to be an architect. And I think it was someone from Sasaki said, well, you know, you're an agritech. And so if you want to learn more about how you do that, and that's what my Instagram is, the Agritech, or my Twitter, you can actually read an article on my LinkedIn. It's called I Want to Be an Agritech. And what you really need is a foundation of 3 parts, which is really hands-on experience in farming, an archive of data, and really building a network of people that you can depend upon as this technology and this industry really evolves, so you get new information. So if you want to be an Agritech, look for that article, and thanks for that question.
Thank you. When a culture has ingrained milk and meat and other animal products as core nutrition sources, how do you combat that for global survival?
I mean, that's an amazing question, because changing culture and mindset around the food we eat is a generational problem. This isn't a switch we're going to flip off overnight. It really needs to start with policy that's going to impact pocketbook. When we start to limit the amount of land that's available for livestock or cattle grazing, when we start to limit the amount of rainforest or other remnant forest that's cut down for agricultural purposes, the cost of that land goes up. If we remove government subsidies from certain conventional farms and the way that they're practicing, the cost of those kind of crops, again, which mostly go to feed livestock, goes up. And the price of our beef is going to go up to the point where, great inventions, again, like Beyond Meat or the Impossible Burger, are going to start to replace in the consumer's mind. There's going to kind of be this flip between the cost benefit analysis of buying a real beef burger or buying kind of a soy-based or plant protein burger. So that's where the switch is going to happen. I don't think it's going to be something that's we might necessarily see in our lifetimes. I think it's a slow roll till we get there.
Yeah, I agree with Michael. It's about policy, also about culture, but I think policy will drive that first. We have to stop subsidies to the things that are worse for the environment. I mean, it doesn't make sense across the board that we're subsidizing farming that is worse for the environment. And we're not allowing the farms that are trying to localize agriculture. Why isn't permaculture, regenerative ag subsidized? Why isn't urban farming subsidized? It creates an additional benefit beyond its competing products. And let me give you an example. You know, we worked with St. Jude Children's Hospital. They asked us to do some workshops and conceptualize how they could integrate more urban farming for year-round production at their hospital. And this is, you know, a cancer hospital for children, a very, very sensitive thing. So you go to the cafeteria, and what did I find? The cost of a burger was $3 and the cost of a salad was $6.50. That's subsidies right there. That's the consequences of that. So when a parent goes there with their child that's suffering from cancer, recovering from cancer, what are they going to choose for themselves? What are they going to choose for their child if they're driven by cost, which in a system that has not subsidized healthcare for their residents, they're going to pick the burger. And so that's why that system continues on and on and on and on and on. And it's a really big problem, and it's one that's going to take a while to fix.
Thank you both so much. We have a number of really good questions in the chat and in the Q&A box, which we will follow up on and post responses in writing on the website on carbon-positive.org. Thank you both so much for this session and for your presentations. We are going to move on to the next one.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good day. Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Natasha.
Thank you, Natasha.
If anyone in the audience is curious about what's happening next or wants to find which session is most interesting to them, you can look at the agenda again on that carbon-positive.org website and see the later sessions and the tool tutorials that are available. Thank you.